Hi, I'm Mark Lynch, Director of the Project on Middle East Political Science and the Institute for Middle East Studies at George Washington University. I'd like to welcome you back to our series of POMEPS conversations with leading experts in Middle East political science. With us today, we have David Patel of Cornell University, my alma mater, and we're going to be talking about some issues with the political science of the Middle East.
I was not his dissertation advisor, though, just to be clear on that.
Just to be clear. So let's start with some of what you were doing in your dissertation. You were in Iraq doing some research in 2003, 2004, at a time when very few political scientists were there. What were you doing and what were you trying to achieve, and did it work?
Okay, well, we probably needed more political scientists back in 2003 in Iraq. But in Iraq, the state collapsed throughout all of Iraq, or at least in the Arab portions of Iraq at the same time. And the question I was asking initially was, why were some Iraqis able to substitute for the state? So even though the Iraqi state was weak in the 1990s, it still did things, provided basic order, picked up trash, provided cooking fuel, distribution of public services. All that stopped at the same time throughout Arab portions of Iraq. And so I was trying to explain why Iraqis were able to substitute for the state, do things for themselves in some places but not other places. And I ended up looking especially at Friday mosques, not in doing it for people or creating an organization to do it for people, but in helping Iraqis do it by disseminating messages, information in ways that Iraqis knew that other Iraqis were hearing these messages. So the preacher would say, we got lots of problems. Here's how we're going to solve them. Here's how we're going to prioritize them, and then here's how we're going to fix it. And Iraqis began to rely on the mosque messages to know what other Iraqis thought. And so normally when we think about actors turning to authorities like preachers, we talk about legitimacy, but legitimacy is exogenous, it's pre-existing. I tried to show how that legitimacy of Islamic actors, and some Islamic actors, preachers, emerged endogenously in the process of creating order. And although this was really focused on Iraq, the state collapse that we saw in Iraq is not dissimilar from the state collapse that we've seen in Libya and in Syria. Quite different than what we saw, though, in Afghanistan and Yemen, where the state slowly either didn't exist in many parts of the country, or as the state withered away, Afghanis and Yemenis had to find other ways to provide these goods. The collapse of the state in Libya and throughout most of Syria is quite similar to what I think I saw in Iraq in 2003.
So there was nothing intrinsic to the religion itself then? It could have been a set of organizations providing this information or providing these services?
Well, so that's the big question, right? Was it just the getting the message, or was there something else about religion? One of the things people oftentimes say about Iraq, though, was that the mosque was the only institution that had some sort of legitimacy or authority. The puzzling thing is, though, it really didn't, right? Shias did not hold Friday sermons. Muqtada Sadr's father, Grand Ayatollah Muhammad Sadiq Sadr, very briefly restarted Friday sermons in the mosques affiliated with him from about 94 until 1999. But those stopped after March 1999 or February 1999. So there were no sermons in Shia mosques. Going to a Friday sermon was a new thing for Iraqi Shia. But within a few weeks of them beginning, it became the fundamental way that Iraqis locally knew what other Iraqis knew in areas. And so it was a new innovation. And there were lots of other actors. The amazing thing about Iraq in 2003 is everybody was trying to mobilize there. Trade unions, communists. The first flag I saw, the first time I drove into Iraq from the Kuwaiti border to Basra, was a flag I didn't recognize. It was the flag that from the 1958 revolution. It was the old Republic flag. And people were trying to mobilize along all sorts of lines. But it was religious actors, and some religious actors, clerics, that ended up becoming prominent. And so a lot of the work was focused on that. But I do make the authority endogenous to the argument.
When you see similar kinds of revivals happening in lots of different contexts, including ones where the state didn't collapse, like Egypt or Jordan, does that complicate the argument?
Well, it depends on, first of all, a lot of different people could be mobilizing along religious lines. So sometimes it could be clerical, sometimes it could be non-clerical. In Iraq, you saw a lot of actors trying to say, like the Supreme Council or various parts of Dawah, because it didn't necessarily reform as a coherent party. It had been split in the 80s and 90s and between Tehran and Damascus and London. There were lots of laymen who were claiming that we're the ones who are going to protect Islam. We're the ones who are going to institute a system that's reliant on Islamic law. Most of the Islamic actors you see in most other countries are run by laymen. Over time, it ends up becoming more and more layman focused. So there could be different reasons why religious actors become prominent.
Now, one of the papers that you wrote went back to the 1991 failed uprising and the impact that that had on the networks themselves. Yeah. Can you say a little bit about that? What do Shia networks look like in 2003 when they begin this task of trying to establish themselves against all of these competing claims?
So a lot of people have looked at the effect of the 1991 uprising, and especially in the last 3 or 4 years, there's been some great work being done on this. A nice book on sectarianism in Iraq. Yeah, exactly. There's some other work coming out. I really looked at this uprising in 1999 that very few people know about. So Muqtada Sadr's father, who set up he was a grand ayatollah, set up a rival network to Sistanis in many ways throughout the 1990s with the help of the regime. He was assassinated in February. He started in his Friday sermons to turn against the regime, to be critical of the Ba'athist regime. He was assassinated. Throughout the rest of 1990, the regime cracks down on the Sadrists. They arrest dozens of them. Human rights reports that document this. There's some declassified documents that document the arrest and persecution of preachers. The Sadr organization, in my understanding, disappeared in Iraq from 1999 to 2003. A lot of them were arrested. Some of them tried to rise in revolt in March 1999, and the crackdown really began after that. And so the Sadr movement, we have this image of it as continuing on. That was there before, it was there underground in the late Saddam period, and then just emerged after 2003. My sense is that's wrong. What happened is the Sadr movement was broken apart. It was defeated. And after 2003, there were a lot of different people coming up trying to reconstitute that or claim the mantle of Muhammad Sadiq Sadr. And even today in Iraq, he's a very powerful symbol. He stood up to Saddam at a time when no one else did. And so Muqtada Sadr controls a fraction of his father's old clerical network. Other ones started following a cleric from Iran. Several of his students have declared themselves grand ayatollahs. Muhammad Yaqubi did. There's these guys, Hassan Asarki. There's millenarian movements that have stolen some. The Iranian forces have basically come in and purchased portions of those old networks, as I understand it. So there's a lot of splintering among the Sadrists. So there's a lot of work that talks about the Sadrists as a unified bloc. They're extremely fractured, organizationally, in some ways ideologically. And I think that reflects the 99 uprising in ways that we don't fully understand because very few people have written about it or worked on it.
Well, what happens, though, when the state reconstitutes itself and now these, the Shia networks become part of the regime, if not part of the state? What effect does that have, in your opinion, on their ability to play the role you've described?
So I was back in Basra in summer 2011, and clerics play a different role now. People look to the state. They know that the state is going to provide a tremendous number of goodies in the future, and that's what people are after. Clerics who used to be mobilizing people in the community in order to help the community do things for themselves are now serving as conduits between that community and the state. Sometimes the clerics themselves are in provincial councils, but more often they have wasta, right? You need something from the state, you go visit your cleric, he writes a note, that note then gets you into an office, gets you some health care, gets your son a job. And so in many ways they don't have official positions in the state in most places, but there's certainly ways you can access state resources. And the Iraqi state resources are going up and up and up, but so is the population. And so eventually there's competition for those resources, and clerics have found themselves in the advantageous position of being conduits. The clerical hierarchy, and Najaf is very worried about this. They're very worried that clerics are going to be less connected to them and much more connected to people and be individual conduits of goodies and patronage. And so there's a lot of, it's hard to get these intra-clerical dynamics, but my sense is within the clerical networks, they're very worried about this sort of focus on patronage provision.
That's really interesting. Let's move next door for a second, a place like Syria where you don't have those kinds of established religious networks, and the relationship between the state and the religious establishment is very different. Yeah. What would you expect to see emerge? Has it surprised you in any way, or what might you predict?
Well, so in Iraq, I was looking at the difference between Sunnis and Shias, because the Shias have a very structured hierarchical system. The Shia, everyone talks about the difference between Sunnis and Shias, and they start talking about the succession to Muhammad. That's important. But that's like trying to describe the difference between Protestants and Catholics by talking about Martin Luther. It's part of it. But I think if you describe the clergy and ritual practice now, you probably have a better understanding of how it affects people's lives. The Shia clergy was very hierarchical. The Sunni clergy is not, in general. It's much more horizontal. It doesn't have an institutionalized hierarchical understanding of authority the same way Usuli 12 or Shiism does. And in Iraq, they were co-opted by the state. In Syria, it's even more so. Sunni clerics in Syria are very well connected to the state. There's some nice work on this by some German scholars. Annabelle Butcher, I think, did some nice work on.
Thomas Piret.
Yeah. And so the Ministry of Religious Endowments, it exists in almost all Arab countries. In Syria, it very tightly controlled what preachers said. I don't think we understand how that varied. I interviewed some preachers in Hama, Syria, actually, back in, I think, 2006, 2007. And they had topics listed for them that they were supposed to talk about in their Friday sermons. So now the question is, can these clerics, who are the traditional preachers in these mosques, they're connected to the state. They're seen probably by the public as co-opted by the state. Will they be able to develop followings on their own in some legitimacy, right? In a sense of saying something and people following them on their own? I think that's going to be difficult. And especially now that there's an enormous influx, as I understand it, of outside actors, especially those who claim to speak for Islam. I think there's going to be it's going to be very challenging for them to develop these core followings.
Let me ask you a broader question. I know some of the work you're doing right now is about whether this Shia model of Shia Revival is going to spread out around the region. And so how does this play out?
So this idea of a Shia revival, the idea that competition within states and between states in the Middle East is divided on sectarian lines between Sunnis and Shias, and this is an age-old competition for power. This is very alluring. It's a powerful idea, and a number of prominent academics, not just Vali Nasser, but Yitzhak Nakash and others have written on this. And I think here in DC, it's particularly powerful because it helps people to make sense of things they may not be able to fit in their understanding of. So for example, they hear about an uprising in northern Yemen by the Houthis, and suddenly it allows them to put that in a framework. And I think it's wrong. When people talk about the Shia revival, very rarely are they clear on the processes of demonstration effects or diffusion. Very rarely are they specific on the conditions under which we would expect to see it. And if you actually look at the mobilization of Shia in various countries from 2003 on, I think what you see is Shia who were already mobilized as Shia before 2003 are still mobilized, and they're not mobilizing in new ways. Hezbollah, Shia in Bahrain, they're still mobilized the way they have been. You don't see Shias in other countries who haven't mobilized as Shia, mobilizing in new ways.
What about in Eastern Province in Saudi Arabia?
They're doing the same thing they've been doing for a long time. And the leaders there they'll cite Sistani when it's convenient. They also cite Richard Nixon in the US Constitution when it's convenient, right? But you haven't seen like the Shiraziyin aren't developing new connections and mobilizing them in new ways. Certainly they've been inspired by the broader Arab Spring, but that's not necessarily a Shia phenomenon.
I think in Washington, the fear, of course, is that Iran will exploit this.
So that's a different thing, though. You see a lot of newspaper articles that describe Sunni Saudi Arabia and Shia Iran. Using those adjectives, Sunni and Shia, conditions you to think that any competition between those two states is because of this religious affinity or ideology, when in reality, maybe Saudi Arabia and Iran are rivals for nothing to do with religion. Maybe they're rivals because they're two oil powers. They're two regional hegemons. They see declining US influence in the region. They suddenly don't have Iraq as a counterbalance between them. And so they're rival. Maybe you don't need to take Middle East classes to understand the competition between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Maybe you need to take more general international relations classes.
But then the contrast, of course, is that now you're spending all of your time digging deep down into the Shia clerical networks in Iraq, which your theory seems to tell you doesn't matter.
No, it matters certainly within Iraq.
For different things.
Yeah, and I think those clerical networks do connect to clerical networks in Iran, and they're in competition in many ways. They're in competition with different clerical networks that are in Iran.
So do you think that a Dawah party, whether Maliki or some other prime minister, is going to necessarily be aligned with Iran,
No.
or do you think it's just a...
When it's convenient for them, they'll be aligned with Iran. They're neighbors with Iran. They're always going to be neighbors with Iran, and they realize that, right? And that shapes their policy. But the idea that somehow because they're Shia, and the Shia of Iran and Iraq have very different histories, very different languages. Iraq doesn't have a Shia majority population until 1900 probably, very late converts to Shiism. Very different histories. Maliki himself is not, there's no evidence he ever learned Persian. There's no evidence that he has any particular affinity. This idea that somehow because they share a religion they're going to be closer is really nonsense. It's really...
But what about the payroll?
There's a country that spent tens of billions of dollars on buying off of Iraqi politicians that spilled countless volumes of blood in Iraq, and that was the United States. And we couldn't get Iraqi actors to do what we wanted them to do. Somehow, the idea that Iranians, with a fraction of the resources, a fraction of the money, are going to get them to dance the way they want, you know, it's wishful thinking. But it's convenient. There's people who want to say all the problems in the Middle East are because of Iran, that Tehran is the enemy. And if you want to fix our problems, you've got to focus on Iran and bomb Iran. And so there's a lot of pressure, I think, to kind of look towards Iran for an answer to our problems, when in reality, Iraqi politics is being determined by Iraqis.
All right, I'd like to thank David Patel, Cornell University, and thank you all for watching POMEPS Conversations.